there is a process that is kind of natural to go through when we are thinking about whether or not a relationship is healthy, whether somebody is good for us, setting boundaries. And I think it's important to talk about the difference between these two things. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. These two things are reasons and excuses. And I've certainly talked about this to some degree, probably in a fair amount of videos. But it's something that I think really is something that so many people can struggle with. And we can question ourselves and think that we're being maybe too hard or too judgmental or too rigid or something like that. And I think that it can really cause us to not honor our own intuition and ability to trust in ourselves. So this really does tend to come up quite a bit in conversations that I have around boundaries, and this is associated with boundaries, but in particular, being in relationship with somebody, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship or even a family relationship, and looking at something that somebody is doing and not really feeling okay about it, yet not being able to feel confident in whether that's something that is kind of excusable in a sense. And I'm not here to tell you whether something is excusable or not. I mean, there are some things that I don't think are excusable under any circumstance, but that's not really what this video is about. I really want to talk about, in our own minds, for every individual, in our own minds, being able to acknowledge and recognize that there may be reasons why somebody might behave in a certain way or do things in a certain way, and they could be real reasons. They can be heartbreaking reasons potentially, but it never makes it okay that they're doing it. And I know for so many people, I have certainly struggled with this too. I think everybody I've ever known and worked with, this has been a struggle. When we're thinking about these relationships or these situations, we'll think about what has gone on with that person and maybe why they're doing what they're doing now. And then we reason that therefore, because there is this reason, we should let it go, or we shouldn't make a big deal out of it, or we should forgive them and move on, that we shouldn't want maybe this boundary that we're wanting to set. So we talk ourselves out of the reality of the experience and what we feel, what we want, and oftentimes that intuition that is saying, this really isn't okay. So one of the ways that this comes up a lot is that people will say, well, they had a lot of trauma, or they've had, I don't know, a really stressful several years, or something along those types of lines. And so therefore, their way of being, their way of showing up in the relationship, their behavior in a given circumstance is not so bad because they've had all these bad things happen, or they've had this thing happen recently, and that's why they're doing what they're doing. And there can be reasons that somebody is doing something that they're doing. In fact, there's always a reason, whether we're aware of it or not, whether they're aware of it or not. But just because there is a reason, it does not excuse it. And by excuse, what I mean, what people tend to go to is rationalizing and saying, well, they get a pass because they're having a really hard time, or because we all struggle and it might just look different for them and I need to be patient, or I need to be accepting, or whatever. And there's a place for that, to a degree. And I want to be very clear about that, because there may be somebody watching this who feels like you have done, or other people have pointed out to you that maybe you've done something that has been hurtful. And I don't want you to feel like that you're a lost cause, or that nobody should want to be around you or anything. That's not at all what I'm saying. And even for people in our lives, if you've got somebody in your life who doesn't handle things in the best way, I'm not necessarily saying that, I'm certainly not saying that that is a bad person. And I'm not even necessarily saying that you shouldn't have anything to do with that person. What I'm mostly trying to say for this video, and really this is a conversation that could be ongoing, and we could talk about all different types of nuanced aspects to it. But for the sake of this video, I really want you to be able to hold space for the reality that there could be reasons that somebody is doing something, but that reason does not mean that you are then obligated to tolerate, to be on the receiving end of behavior that is wrong, inappropriate, abusive, hurtful, or any of those things. Because you're absolutely not. And no matter what is going on with us as individuals, just generally across the board, there is never an excuse to treat somebody else in an abusive or harmful way. Now, again, that doesn't mean that if we recognize it and we ask for forgiveness, that we're not deserving of that forgiveness. Now, whether that person wants to forgive us or not is their own thing, but it doesn't mean that we are undeserving of forgiveness necessarily at all. And so when you are somebody on the receiving end of some of that, and you're thinking about setting a boundary and feeling bad about it, and thinking, well, they don't really deserve for me to set this boundary because they didn't really mean it, or they were having a hard time, it's really important for you to be able to recognize and really accept that no matter what somebody is going through, it doesn't make it okay. It doesn't mean that you have to forgive. It doesn't mean that you don't have a right to feel what you feel or want what you want as a result of that. Because you do. And in all reality, especially if there's a bit of a pattern of certain types of behavior that is not healthy, appropriate, potentially harmful, emotionally, physically, or in any way, it's really important for you to recognize that no matter the reason, you have a right, and it is important for you to be able to set the boundary that you need around that. So let's say you have a friend, and that friend is going through, maybe they have a history of trauma, and maybe there's something that's going on with them. Let's pretend it's not necessarily really traumatic, but maybe kind of difficult for them. It's just stressful for them or whatever. And they start doing things that are not healthy, that are kind of inappropriate, an inappropriate way to treat a friend, maybe even being kind of hurtful, whether it's by like completely ignoring you, or like maybe setting up a time to get together and they just don't show up, and it becomes a pattern. Or maybe they're actually like taking it out on you, so to speak. Under no circumstance is that okay. Now, depending on the totality of the relationship, let's say that aside from this period of time, that friend it's been equal. I've talked about that before. And that friend is generally shows up in healthy ways and is kind of an equal friendship, and this is really, really out of character for them. In a situation like that, I think it's still important to name what's happening, to address it, but it certainly doesn't mean that you need to end the relationship as a result of it. So you're recognizing something, there's definitely something going on here. This is not normal for this person. And so you could choose to have a conversation with them and point it out. You could, let's say you try to mitigate the inappropriate way they're showing up and it's not working. You could choose to maybe set a boundary where you're going to limit a little bit of the time that you're spending around them. Or if they start behaving in a particular way that you've identified as not particularly good or healthy, maybe you just remove yourself from the situation. So there's lots of different ways it can look, but it's important, again, coming back to this point, that even if somebody is going through something difficult, it doesn't mean that you have to be there to be, so to speak, the punching bag. And that could be literal, but I mean it generally more figuratively, right? Because I think every one of us can probably relate to being on the receiving end of somebody's stressful time, bad mood, really difficult time where they're struggling with something. I think we can all probably relate to that. And those relationships, when you look at the totality of the relationship, those relationships can continue and be healthy, but it has to be addressed. And maybe you're just addressing it within yourself, thinking, okay, this is going to be a temporary thing and I'll give it a week and see how it goes or whatever. As long as you're safe and not continuing to put yourself in a situation where you're being harmed, including emotionally, then you can give it time. And I think if you've had an ongoing relationship that has been pretty healthy, then the relationship, unless there's other things going on there, the relationship may be certainly worthy of giving it a little bit more time. But you never owe it to somebody to allow them to continue to treat you in a way that is unhealthy, that is inappropriate and hurtful. And even if that is for a period of time, you can say, I know you're stressed, but this really doesn't feel good to me. Or when you yell at me, or when you, I don't know what's going on with you, but the way that you're talking to me just really doesn't feel good. And if you don't stop, I'm going to hang up. Or, if you don't stop, then I think we shouldn't go do this thing that we had planned to do. You don't necessarily have to verbalize it exactly like that, but it is important to be able to recognize how you're being impacted by that. Now, having said all of that, how do we know? Is it a situation in which I back off? Or do I try to have this conversation and try to help this person out? And probably the majority of you are somebody who is going to be the kind of person who wants to help them try to figure it out because you want people to feel better, and you might even feel responsible for them feeling bad. And so you're likely going to put yourself in a situation where you continue to be treated in a certain way because you think that that's reasonable and you want to help them. So there isn't a clear-cut answer in terms of where do you draw that line. I think looking at the relationship as a whole, I think looking at how significant is the behavior at this particular time, basically how unhealthy is it, making sure that you have your own support, that you, like if you have a friend and that friend is really going through something and they're just really like venting, and in that venting they're yelling and they're complaining and they're just really kind of angry, and maybe that doesn't feel good to you. Doesn't necessarily mean that you can't listen as long as it's not directed at you, because that's different, right? But then making sure that you are taking care of yourself afterward. So whether that means just some self-care in some way, maybe it means connecting with somebody else that can kind of help fill your cup back up, but doing something that can really help you move out of that space. Those things are important. The line at which you differentiate which is going to have to be up to you. What I most, again, want you to take from it is recognizing that there is a line, that it's okay to have a line, that you deserve to be able to determine what that line is so that you can take care of yourself. And I know for so many people watching this, there's going to be a lot of situations in your life in which it isn't just some sudden situation where it's a one-time thing. Probably the majority of you watching this have had different people in your life, maybe at different times, that have behaved in ways that are not conducive to being in a healthy relationship. And you've not known you could have a line. You've not known where that line should be. You've felt guilty about having that line. Maybe even shame around having that line. You have felt responsible for how that person is feeling and therefore feel like you can't have a line. So those are the things that I think are really, really important to recognize for yourself, probably first and foremost, because without that, what you're going to choose to do as a result, well, it isn't going to happen because you're not going to feel like it's okay to have a line. And depending on what's going on with you at any given time, that line might change a little bit, and that is okay too. I think a lot of times people, when they're thinking about like a boundary or something, or whether somebody's healthy or not to be in a relationship with, it kind of feels like it has to be all or nothing. And like you have to know exactly, again, kind of like where that line is. And there are some days that, depending on what is going on with us, we might have more capacity to hear somebody's trauma, right? Other days, depending on what's going on with us, we may not have as much capacity without it impacting us. And so it certainly doesn't make that other person wrong for sharing with us, but it's important for us to be able to recognize what our capacity is. And again, that could be a whole separate video as well, and how to navigate that. But recognizing that it doesn't have to be black and white. In fact, certainly there are some things that will be black and white about this, but a lot of times there isn't necessarily going to be a black and white answer in terms of what you're feeling like you can or desire to experience. One thing that I hear a whole lot is, and this happens with family members, and I would say most often I probably hear this about moms, but certainly it comes up even with siblings, certainly any other parent, whether it's a step parent or a father. But people will often say, if they've been hurt, certainly if they've been abused, but even if it wasn't direct abuse, but maybe neglect in some way, or they didn't know that the abuse was happening, they didn't support you, they didn't believe you, whatever it might be, taking somebody else's side all the time. Oftentimes people will say, and this is part of how we cope, so it kind of goes back to the way that we rationalize things so that they don't hurt as much. But people will often say that, well, this person had a really tough life, or they didn't have it modeled, or something like that. And those things may be true. And those things are very valid in terms of their life and their struggle. Those things are certainly things that I would hope that they would work on being able to heal from. However, those may be reasons that somebody may have a pattern of showing up in a particular way, but it is not an excuse. It's not an excuse. And when we rationalize it, when we make excuses for it, it creates problems within the relationship. It reinforces our own beliefs about ourselves and our experiences, it minimizes them, and that creates a whole host of problems in terms of healing, and certainly in terms of trying to create healthy boundaries and relationships. So again, what I really want to be expressing here is giving yourself permission to recognize, to honor that it's important to have a line. It's important for your healing, absolutely, but it's also important for your overall sense of well-being, to be able to do that in the various aspects of our lives. And when you feel like you can trust, which takes time and healing, but when you feel like you can trust that it really is okay to have that line, from that place, you begin to recognize and practice what it means to have that line. You start to recognize that maybe this really isn't okay. Maybe I really don't have to do this. Maybe this isn't what healthy relationships look like. Maybe there is something else I could experience. And as all of that begins to happen, you start to feel more confident and safe in not only setting boundaries that need to be set, but also as you choose relationships in your life, again, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship, you approach that from a place of trust within yourself, that if something should happen that isn't healthy or appropriate, that you will be able to recognize it, that you will be able to do something about it, and kind of resolve whatever that is, whether it's by walking away or being able to say something to help shift what is happening in that relationship. Because you deserve that. And another piece of this that might be helpful to consider is that in doing that, particularly if you are able to have some sort of conversation or acknowledgement with that person, in doing that, you are also helping them, even if they don't see it as help at that particular time. But so often what happens in relationships is people will recognize that there's a line and they don't want to cross anymore, and then just exit and that be the end of it. And then the other person, and there's not necessarily something wrong with that. I think that's a reasonable thing to do in quite a few circumstances, especially depending on where you are emotionally. But if we can actually say something, if we can confront something, if we can have a conversation about it, and if we say, this, I'm done because of this, or, this really doesn't feel good to me, and then you just stop returning their calls or whatever, you've given them information about their behavior that they can choose, and sometimes it takes a long time, but they can then choose what to do with that. If nobody ever says anything to them, if they're never called out on that, whether something small or something big, then they're likely never going to know what the actual problem is, because they clearly don't see it as an actual problem, or they probably wouldn't be doing it. They would have done the work to try to change it, or they don't think it's that big of a problem. But if it's pointed out to them, while it may not change anything then, it's certainly going to plant a seed, or maybe you're watering seeds that other people have planted, for them to recognize that there's something there for them to work on. And depending on the circumstance and who that person is, it might actually lead them to seeking therapy, to seeking out the kind of help that they need to be able to shift things so that they can feel happier and healthier in their life and relationships. So it's important to have a line. You deserve and are worthy of being able to have that line and honor where that line is for you. That line does not have to be absolute. It can feel different or be different on different days. I think if it is changing back and forth, that it's important to recognize that for yourself. And if somebody oversteps something, and today is one of those days that you're more vulnerable ultimately, and that line has shifted, it's important to recognize that you have shifted that line, and maybe what's normally okay for you, that line wouldn't have been crossed. So I don't want you to just immediately write people out of your life when you're in that place and that line has been crossed. Now, there certainly are some exceptions to that, and abuse, I think, is one of them. Certainly physical abuse if you are in danger. Or again, when you're looking at the totality, is this a pattern of ongoing behavior? Because that's very different, right? So important to have a line. It's healthy to have the line, to acknowledge the line, to honor the line. And it is healthy certainly for you, and even oftentimes for the other person, for you to choose that you are no longer willing to have that line crossed. I would really love to hear from you. Just what came up for you? Did you notice thinking about any particular types of situations or relationships? And I do want to be clear that I am absolutely not saying that somebody screws up and we write them out of our lives, because we all screw up. We all screw up at times. We all will cross somebody's line if we're in a really bad place, maybe unintentionally, maybe without knowing the line exists. That happens often. So I just want to be clear that I'm not at all making that person out to be a bad person. But that's part of it, is that somebody doesn't have to be a bad person, whatever that might mean. Somebody doesn't have to be a bad person for us to choose to have that line and boundary, for us to no longer be willing to accept certain types of behavior or treatment. Because people can get hung up on that a lot too. Look at all the good things that they're doing and feel like that bad thing that feels really hurtful to us doesn't really matter because, well, they're good in these ways. You have a right, and I think an obligation to yourself and to that little one inside of you that needs you to stand up for them and protect them, to honor what it is that you need and the boundaries that you set. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for being here. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.